Who let him in here? The voice cut sharp across the polished auditorium as Ethan Brooks stepped past the doors, his worn boots leaving faint dust marks on a floor that gleamed like it had never known struggle. A few parents turned, eyes narrowing, lips curling into quiet judgment. And somewhere near the front, a man in a tailored navy suit chuckled under his breath. Maintenance entrances around back. Buddy. 3 voices, 3 small laughs. Quick and careless, like they'd done this before. Ethan didn't stop, didn't answer right away. He just adjusted the small backpack slipping off his daughter Lily's shoulder, her fingers tightening around his hand. And then he said, calm and steady, I'm here to fix the power. 2 seconds of silence followed, the kind that doesn't come from respect, but from confusion, because no one expected him to speak without apology. And as the fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting that cold, even glow across polished wood and pressed suits, Ethan kept walking, not fast, not slow, just certain, like a man who had already decided who he was long before anyone else in the room had an opinion. Near the center aisle, a clipboard snapped shut, heels clicked once, twice, and a woman looked up from her notes, Clara Whitmore, her expression composed, but her eyes sharper than the room deserved. She noticed the way Ethan didn't lower his gaze, didn't shrink, didn't explain himself beyond what mattered. And something about that stillness lingered like a quiet note that refused to fade. Sir, you can't just walk in here, another parent said, louder now, emboldened by the audience. This is a private board meeting. 3 quick lines again, sharper this time, pushing him back without ever touching him. But Ethan finally paused, turning slightly, not defensive, not angry, just present. And your kids are going to sit in the dark if I don't, he replied, his voice low but carrying farther than the laughter ever could. And for a moment, just a moment, the room shifted, not fully, not enough to silence them, but enough to make a few heads tilt, a few brows tighten, as if something about him didn't fit the story they'd already written. Lily looked up at him then, eyes wide but trusting, and he gave her the smallest nod, the kind that says everything without words, before stepping forward again. Deeper into a space that clearly didn't want him there, the hum of electricity overhead flickering just slightly, almost like the building itself was holding its breath. And Clara watched it all, the quiet defiance, the absence of ego, the way he carried dignity like it didn't need permission. And though no one else noticed, not yet, something in her expression changed, subtle, almost invisible, like the first crack of light before dawn, because in a room full of voices trying to be heard, the only man who didn't raise his voice was the one she couldn't stop noticing. You really think you can just walk in and start fixing things? The man in navy suit said, stepping closer now, his voice lower but sharper like he was used to being obeyed, and a few others leaned in, watching, waiting for Ethan Brooks to finally break, to apologize, to step back into the role they had already assigned him. Ethan set his tool bag down gently on the polished floor, the zipper sound soft but steady, then looked up, not at the man's suit, not at his watch, but straight into his eyes. I think the lights are about to go out, he said simply, 3 words, no attitude, no fear, just fact. And right on cue, a flicker passed through the overhead fixtures, a subtle dimming that made the room hesitate, like a breath caught mid-sentence. A few parents glanced up, uneasy now, their earlier laughter thinning into murmurs. Is that supposed to happen? Someone whispered, while another scoffed. Probably just a glitch. But the confidence in his voice was already fading. Across the aisle, Clara Whitmore closed her folder slowly, her fingers resting on the edge as she watched Ethan kneel beside a wall panel, his movements precise, unhurried, like he had done this 1,000 times before and never once needed an audience. And something about that quiet competence unsettled the room more than any argument could have. Sir, you need authorization, a staff member insisted, stepping forward with forced authority, clipboard clutched tightly. We cannot have unauthorized work being done during a board session. 3 quick objections again, layered with policy and pride. But Ethan did not stop. He did not even look up this time. Then you can explain to everyone why the system failed, he replied, voice even, as his fingers worked the panel open with a soft metallic click. 2 seconds of silence followed. Heavier now, because this time was not confusion, it was doubt. Lily stood just behind him, her small sneakers planted firmly, watching her father like he was the only steady thing in a room that suddenly felt less certain, and the lights above flickered again, longer this time, casting brief shadows across faces that had been so sure of themselves moments ago. Clara took a step forward then, heels quiet now, her voice cutting through the rising tension without force. "Let him continue," she said, not loud but clear, and for the first time, no one laughed, no one interrupted. They just looked at her, then back at Ethan, as if something invisible had shifted in the balance of the room. Ethan adjusted a loose wire, his hands steady despite the eyes on him, and for a brief second, the entire auditorium dimmed, a soft collective inhale passing through the crowd, before the lights steadied again brighter, stronger, like the building itself had chosen to trust him. He closed the panel slowly, standing back up without triumph, without a single word of recognition, just a quiet nod to Lily, and in that moment, the room did not erupt into applause, it did not offer thanks, it simply fell into a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when certainty cracks and something deeper begins to take its place. And Clara saw it clearly, the shift from judgment to something quieter, something closer to respect, and she knew, though no one else did yet, that the story they thought they were watching had already begun to change. "So that is it," the man in the navy suit said, forcing a thin smile as the lights steadied, his voice carrying just enough edge to reclaim control. "You tighten a few wires and suddenly you are the hero of the room." A few scattered chuckles followed, weaker now, less certain, like echoes of confidence that no longer fit the moment. Ethan Brooks did not respond. He simply wiped his hands on a clean cloth from his bag, slow, deliberate, then zipped the tools away with the same quiet care he had. Shown from the beginning, 3 small actions, no performance, no need for approval. Lily looked up at him, her voice soft but clear. "Does that mean it is?" "Fixed, Dad," he nodded once, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "It means the lights will stay on." 2 sentences, simple, grounded, and somehow steadier than anything else said in the room. Across the aisle, Clara Whitmore watched the exchange, not the words, but the way Ethan's attention never drifted toward the people who had mocked him, never reached for recognition, only returned to what mattered. And that stillness pressed gently against something she had been carrying for years. Something unspoken, something tired. "We still need proper authorization for future work," the staff member added quickly, trying to reassemble the structure of control. "There are procedures for a reason." 3 quick assertions again, sharper than necessary, but thinner now, like paper stretched too tight. And this time, Ethan finally looked up, not confrontational, not defensive, just present. "Then call me when the procedures stop the lights from working," he said, calm and even. And for a moment, no one answered, because the truth in it did not need to be raised to be heard. A faint hum settled back into the room, steady now, the kind of quiet that follows after something shifts but no one wants to name it yet, and a few parents exchanged glances, subtle, uncertain, as if reconsidering something they had already decided. Clara stepped forward then, her heels no longer echoing with authority, but with intention. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice softer than before, yet somehow more certain. "Thank you." 3 words, simple, but they landed differently because they were not offered out of obligation. They were chosen, and Ethan gave a small nod in return, not surprised, not changed, just acknowledging like gratitude was something he accepted but never depended on. The man in the navy suit exhaled sharply, adjusting his cufflinks as if resetting himself. "Well, if everything is handled, we can return to the agenda," he said, his tone recovering structure. But the room did not quite return with him. Something remained altered, subtle but present, like a line that had been crossed without anyone noticing when it happened. Ethan reached for Lily's hand again, his grip steady, warm, and began to walk back toward the exit, not waiting, not lingering, just leaving the way he had entered, without noise, without claim. And as he passed Clara, their eyes met for a brief second. No words exchanged, but something understood, something. quiet and undeniable. And as the doors closed softly behind him, the room filled once more with voices, but none of them carried the same certainty they had just minutes before. Funny how quiet it gets when the right person stops trying to be loud, Clara Whitmore said under her breath as the doors closed behind Ethan Brooks, her eyes still fixed on the space he had just walked through, but the room around her had already begun to rebuild itself. Voices rising again, chairs shifting, papers sliding across polished wood as if nothing had happened. "Let us proceed," the man in the navy suit said, tapping his pen twice against the table, sharp, controlled. "We were discussing budget reallocations for next quarter." 3 quick statements, confident again, but thinner now, like they needed to be repeated to feel real, and a few heads nodded, eager to return to familiar ground, to structure, to hierarchy. Clara took her seat slowly, folding her hands in front of her, her posture composed, but her mind no longer in the room they thought they controlled, because what she had just seen did not fit into their charts or projections. It did not ask for approval. It simply existed, quiet and undeniable. "We need to address the lower campus," another board member added, flipping through a report. "Maintenance costs are exceeding acceptable margins, and frankly, the return on investment is minimal." A few murmurs of agreement followed, quick, efficient, detached, like they were discussing numbers, not people, not classrooms filled with children who depended on lights that worked and teachers who stayed. Clara's fingers tightened slightly against the table. Not enough to be noticed, just enough to register. "Those are students," she said, her voice calm, even cutting through the rhythm of their discussion without raising itself. And the room paused again, not as long as before, but long enough to feel the shift. The man in the navy suit leaned back, studying her now with a measured expression. "They are part of a system, Clara," he replied, smooth, practiced. "And systems require efficiency." 3 words, polished, familiar, but lacking something. Real, something that could stand on its own without being repeated. Clara held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, just present. "And people require dignity," she answered, just as steady. And this time, no one laughed, no one interrupted, because the room had already learned, even if they did not admit it, that quiet truths carried further than confident assumptions. Outside, in the parking lot, Ethan opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck, the metal creaking softly as Lily climbed in, her small voice breaking the silence they had carried with them. "They did not like you very much," she said, not as a complaint, just an observation. And Ethan smiled faintly as he closed the door, walking around to the driver's side. "That is all right," he replied, settling into the seat, his hands resting briefly on the steering wheel before starting the engine. "I was not there to be liked." 2 sentences, simple, grounded, and, as the truck rumbled to life, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the school building behind them, Lily nodded slowly, as if understanding something she could not yet fully explain. Back inside, Clara stood again, this time not waiting for permission, not adjusting to the rhythm of the room, but stepping slightly outside of it. "I would like to review that section again," she said, her voice calm but firm, and though the agenda had not changed, the meaning behind it had, because somewhere between a flicker of lights and a man who refused to shrink, something quiet had taken root, and it was no longer asking to be ignored. "You are asking us to spend more on a division that brings in the least," the man in the navy suit said, his tone calm, but edged with quiet resistance. Fingers steepled, as if the conclusion had already been decided, and a few heads nodded in rhythm, eager to anchor themselves back into numbers and logic, into something measurable, something safe. Clara Whitmore did not sit this time. She remained standing at the edge of the table, her posture steady, her voice even. "I am asking you to look at what you are not measuring." 3 words, 3 ideas. And for a moment the room hesitated, because what she was pointing to did not fit neatly into the report spread before them. A board member flipped a page, clearing his throat. "With respect, outcomes are measured in performance metrics, enrollment rates, long-term returns." 3 statements, clean, practiced, familiar, but lacking the weight they had carried earlier. And Clara's gaze did not move from him, not challenging, just unwavering. "And what do you measure when a child decides they matter?" she asked quietly, and no one answered. Not immediately, because the question did not come with a chart. It came with something else, something harder to dismiss. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower as Ethan Brooks drove slowly down a two-lane road. The hum of the engine steady, the silence inside the truck comfortable, not empty. And Lily traced a small circle on the fog corner of the window with her finger before speaking. Why did they look at you like that? 3 simple words, honest, unfiltered. And Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. Sometimes people decide who you are before they ask, he replied, his voice calm, like he had answered that question more than once in his life. Lily frowned slightly, considering it. But you fixed their lights, she said, and Ethan allowed a small smile to form. Not proud, not defensive, just real. That was never the part they were looking at. 2 sentences, soft, grounded, and the truck rolled forward through fading light, carrying a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained further. Back in the boardroom, the air felt different now, not louder, not softer, just more aware, like something invisible had shifted and could not be pushed back into place. And Clara stepped closer to the table, resting her fingertips lightly against its surface. We can choose efficiency, she said, her tone steady, measured, or we can choose impact. A pause followed, not forced, not dramatic, just present, and the room listened in a way it had not before, because her words were no longer competing with theirs, they were settling over them. The man in the navy suit exhaled slowly, adjusting his posture. And you believe that man represents impact? He asked, his voice quieter now, less certain, and Clara's answer came without hesitation, without performance. I believe he represents what this place was meant to stand for. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because somewhere between a failing system and a man who expected nothing in return, the definition of value had quietly begun to change. So what exactly are you proposing, Clara? The man in the navy suit asked, his voice slower now, more cautious, as if the ground beneath the conversation had shifted just enough to make certainty. Uncomfortable, and the rest of the board leaned in, not out of agreement, but because they could feel something approaching that did not fit their expectations. Clara Whitmore did not rush her answer. She let the silence settle first, let the weight of the question exist without filling it too quickly. Then she spoke calm and deliberate. I am proposing we stop pretending this is only about numbers. 3 words, 3 beats. And the room held still, because this time there was no easy counter, no immediate correction. A board member adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat softly. Every institution runs on numbers, he said, his tone measured, but lacking the conviction it once carried. Without them, there is no structure, and a few quiet nods followed, but they were slower now, less synchronized, as if even agreement required more thought. Clara stepped slightly closer, her hands resting lightly against the table, not gripping, not pressing, just present. Structure is not the same as purpose, she replied, her voice steady. And again, no one interrupted, because something about the way she spoke no longer invited dismissal. Outside, Ethan Brooks pulled his truck into a small gravel lot beside a modest apartment building, the tires crunching softly as the engine idled for a moment before he turned it off, the quiet that followed familiar, grounding, and Lily unbuckled her seatbelt, glancing at him with that same thoughtful look she had carried since the school. Are we going back tomorrow? She asked, her voice gentle but curious, and Ethan paused, his hand resting briefly on the steering wheel before answering. Only if they need the lights to work, he said, a faint smile touching his expression, not hopeful, not doubtful, just honest. Lily nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense in a way she could feel, even if she could not fully explain it, and together they stepped out of the truck. The evening air cool, the sky dimming into that quiet blue that comes just before night settles in. Back in the boardroom, the man in the navy suit leaned forward, his fingers tapping once against the table, slower now, more deliberate. And where does that leave us? He asked, his tone no longer sharp, but searching, as if the answer mattered more than he expected. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, without challenge, just clarity. It leaves us deciding. What kind of place this is, she said, and the simplicity of it carried further than any argument could have, because it did not tell them what to choose. It asked them to face the choice itself. A quiet settled over the room, deeper this time. Not resistance, not confusion, but recognition, like something they had always known but rarely acknowledged. And one by one, the posture of certainty softened, replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection. Clara straightened slightly, her voice lowering just enough to draw them in. Because today a man walked in here with nothing to gain, she continued, each word measured, grounded, and he gave more to this place in 10 minutes than we have debated for months. And no one spoke, no one moved, because this time the truth did not need defense. It simply stood there undeniable, waiting for them to decide what to do with it. Then maybe the real question is not what we can afford, Clara Whitmore said quietly, her voice no longer pushing against the room but settling into it, but what we are willing to become. 3 words, measured, deliberate, and the board sat still, not out of agreement, but because something in the tone had shifted beyond debate. The man in the navy suit leaned back slowly, his earlier certainty now replaced with something quieter, more calculated. And you believe one man proves that? He asked, not dismissive this time, but probing, as if the answer mattered in a way he did not expect. Clara did not hesitate. She did not soften her gaze. I believe one moment reveals what we have been ignoring, she replied, and the room absorbed it, not quickly, not easily, but deeply enough that no one reached to interrupt. A board member glanced down at the reports in front of him, flipping a page without reading it. The numbers suddenly less anchored than they had felt minutes before. While another shifted in his seat, his posture no longer rigid, but uncertain, as if the conversation had moved somewhere he could not control. Outside, the evening had settled fully now, soft streetlights casting long reflections across the pavement as Ethan Brooks sat at a small kitchen table, a simple plate in front of him, Lily across from him tracing invisible lines along the wood grain with her finger. Did you always fix things like that? She asked, her voice gentle, curious, and Ethan looked at her, not with pride, not with explanation, but with a quiet kind of honesty. I learned to fix what I could, he said, pausing slightly before adding, and leave the rest better than I found it. 2 sentences simple, but carrying something deeper, something that had shaped the way he moved through the world. Lily nodded, absorbing it the way children do, not questioning the meaning, just holding on to the feeling of it, while the small kitchen light above them glowed steady, unremarkable but constant, like the kind of stability that never asks to be noticed. Back in the boardroom, the silence had stretched longer now, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something unspoken, and Clara stepped back slightly, no longer pressing, no longer guiding, just allowing the weight of her words to remain where they had landed. We cannot keep making decisions that only look right on paper, she said finally, her tone softer. Now, but no less clear, not if we still expect this place to mean something. And this time, no one challenged her, no one redirected, because the argument they had relied on had already begun to lose its footing. The man in the navy suit looked around the table, his eyes moving from one face to another, searching for the certainty that used to come easily, but finding only hesitation, reflection, and something closer to reconsideration. And for the first time, he did not speak immediately. He simply sat there, the weight of the room no longer something he could command, but something he had to face. Clara watched him quietly, not with victory, not with pressure, but with patience, because she understood something they were only beginning to see, that change does not arrive loudly. It does not demand attention. It simply enters the room, stands quietly, and waits until no one can ignore it anymore. Then let us stop pretending this is a discussion, the man in the navy suit finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, but carrying something heavier, something closer to decision. And the room shifted again, not with tension, but with attention, because this time everyone understood that something real was about to be said. He straightened slightly, looking directly at Clara Whitmore. You are asking us to change direction. 3 words, slow, deliberate. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation. No, she replied calmly. I am asking you to remember why we chose this direction in the first place. 2 sentences, steady, grounded, and for a moment, no one moved, because the answer did not argue. it reminded. A board member exhaled softly, leaning back in his chair. "And what does that look like in practice?" he asked, not defensive, not dismissive, just uncertain. And Clara stepped forward just enough to close the distance between thought and action. "It looks like we stopped cutting the parts of this school that need us the most," she said, her voice even, each word placed with care, "and we start investing in the people who show us what this place can be." And again, silence followed. Not empty, but full, like something settling in a place after being ignored for too long. Outside, the night had fully arrived, quiet and still, as Ethan Brooks stood at the small sink in his apartment, rinsing a coffee mug under warm water, the steady stream filling the silence without breaking it. And Lily sat nearby at the table, her homework spread out in front of her, though her pencil had not moved for several minutes. "Dad," she said softly, and Ethan turned slightly, listening without interrupting. "Do you think they will call you back?" 3 words, simple, but carrying a quiet hope she did not fully try to hide, and Ethan paused, setting the mug down carefully. "Maybe," he answered, his voice calm, not promising, not dismissing, just honest. "But if they do, it will not be because of what I did today," he added, and Lily looked up, confused for a moment. "Then why?" she asked, and Ethan met her eyes with that same steady presence. "Because of what they decide to see," he said, and the room fell into a gentle quiet again, not uncertain, but thoughtful. Back in the boardroom, the man in the navy suit looked down at the reports in front of him, then slowly closed the folder, the sound soft but final. And when he looked up, again, something in his expression had shifted, not fully changed, but no longer fixed. "Then we review the decision," he said, his tone measured, deliberate, and a ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because it was the first step away from what had already been decided. Clara did not react immediately. She simply nodded once, not as victory, not as relief, but as acknowledgement, because she understood that real change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, one decision at a time. And in that moment, as the room sat in a silence that no longer resisted but reconsidered, something unseen but undeniable began to take root, something that would not need to be forced, only followed. "Then it is settled," the man in the navy suit said, his voice no longer carrying the same authority it once had, but something quieter, something more careful. And as the board members slowly gathered their papers, no one rushed to leave. No one filled the silence with unnecessary words, because what had just shifted in that room was not something that could be undone with conversation. Clara Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, her eyes resting on the empty space at the far end of the table where certainty used to sit so comfortably. And then she turned, walking toward the door not with urgency, but with purpose, her heels soft against the polished floor, as if the building itself no longer needed to be reminded who she was. Outside, the morning sun had just begun to rise over the school grounds, casting a warm, quiet light across the campus as Ethan Brooks stepped out of his truck, toolbox in hand. Not because he had been called, but because the wiring he had seen yesterday still needed finishing, and work, to him, was never about permission. It was about responsibility. Lily waved from the passenger seat before heading toward the front entrance, her small backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, and Ethan watched her for a brief second, the kind of pause that carried more than words ever could, before turning toward the side building where the older classroom stood. Inside, the halls were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a day begins, and Ethan knelt beside the same panel he had opened before, his movement steady, familiar, like a rhythm he trusted more than anything else. Footsteps echoed softly behind him, measured, unhurried, and he did not look up immediately because he did not expect anyone to be there. But when the sound stopped just a few feet away, he turned slightly, and there she was, Clara Whitmore, standing not as a teacher trying to hold her place, but as someone who had already decided hers. "You came back," she said, her voice calm, not surprised, just certain, and Ethan nodded once, his expression unchanged. "It was not finished," he replied, simple, direct, and Clara let a faint smile touch her lips, not amused, not impressed, but something closer to understanding. 3 seconds passed in silence. Not awkward, not empty, just present. And then she spoke again, softer this time. They reviewed the decision, and Ethan did not ask what that meant. He simply waited, because he had never been the kind of man to chase outcomes. Clara stepped closer, her voice steady, carrying no performance, no need to convince. The lower campus stays, she said, and the words settled between them. Not loud, but full, and Ethan gave a small nod, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging, like he had already accepted whatever would come. Another pause followed, longer this time, and Clara's gaze did not waver. And I would like you to stay as well, she added, and this time, the silence carried something different, something deeper, because the offer was not about a job. It was about recognition. Ethan looked at her then, fully, not questioning, not resisting, just present. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough to be felt, like a door opening quietly after being closed for a long time. Clara held his gaze, her voice lowering just enough to carry the truth without weight. I am not choosing you because you fixed the lights, she said, each word measured, grounded. I am choosing you because you never needed anyone to see you do it, and the hallway fell into a stillness that did not ask to be broken, because in that moment, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to argue, only something quiet, undeniable, and finally understood.